And now, the Lowe Post.
Welcome to the Lowe Post podcast, where it's time for the third episode of nobody's favorite podcast gimmick of 2020. So, where the hell were we? And we are going to start today with the defending champion, Toronto Raptors. And I'm thrilled to bring in friend of the program, Koreen, their great beat writer from The Athletic. How are you, sir?
I'm managing. We're hanging, to use your parlance, we're hanging in up here in Canada. How you doing?
Not as well as Canada, I'll tell you that much right now.
Well, look, we're conflicted because, like, every instinct wants us to compare ourselves to you guys, and I'm obviously using that in a broader way than I should. But every instinct's like, oh, look how much better we are than these people. But then we have to check ourselves because, like, we have our own myriad problems. So we're, like, gloating internally, but trying to, figure out how much of that is acceptable and making sure we don't lose sight of, the issues that are very real up here that are similar, just maybe with less volume to you guys.
Toronto is my home away from home. I have not been there since January. I miss it a lot. I love the people. I love the city. And let's talk about the defending champion, Toronto Raptors. Lost Kawhi Leonard to free agency. You may have heard about this.
Yeah.
Essentially every player in the rotation of any importance other than OG Anunoby has been injured at some point this season, and rarely did the injuries overlap, so there's always somebody out. And yet, the Toronto Raptors, defending NBA champions, are 46-18, plus 6.5 scoring differential, second in the East. For the season, they are 11th in offense, which is a little lower than you would expect, and maybe we should expect going forward. And second in defense, I'll repeat that, second in defense by a lot, however, behind the Milwaukee Bucks. They have had a fascinating season given the departure and the void, not just of Kawhi Leonard, but Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard. I mean, rarely do teams just lose their entire starting wing combination and recover like this. And they have reinvented themselves to some degree as the most unpredictable defensive team in the NBA. Zones and triangles and twos and all sorts of shapes and sizes, and throwing Pascal Siakam on a point guard and then a center, and OG Anunoby has emerged as an all-defensive level player. Koreen, remind us where we left off with the Raptors before the season stopped, and what are you looking forward to when they begin playing again?
Well, they had won 4 out of 5 on their final West Coast road trip. It ended with a win in Utah, where some things would happen very quickly after that, as you might recall, 7 years ago or whatever it was, and the Raptors were put into quarantine, and Chris Boucher went grocery shopping, and everybody was up in arms about that for a while.
I didn't know about that. Chris Boucher was a Luke Walton All-Star this year. So there was a grocery shopping.
He was caught grocery shopping within the 14-day quarantine, despite his test coming back negative, and he sort of put out an apology, and it's we were all learning about life.
Well, you know what the important question is?
Go ahead.
What was he buying?
Yeah.
What was worth breaking quarantine? Damn.
I do not have the answers. I did not go there. I think his reputation has emerged unscathed.
Okay.
So I think he's doing
remind us where we were.
Yeah. No, they were playing really well, and most importantly, Marc Gasol had just come back from his second. This is how long it's been. I forgot what body part. I think it was his hamstring. His second hamstring absence that had gone on. Extending over the All-Star break, and in the last 2 games, Norm Powell, who has had his share of injuries this year, in between which he has just played as if he's not missed any time, and I think would have been a real 6th Man of the Year candidate, and maybe a most improved candidate had he played more games. He tweaked his ankle, but was going to be fine. Basically, for the second or third time this year, it looked like everyone was going to be healthy finally. And they were coming into a stretch where they were playing Boston and Milwaukee and the Lakers and Philadelphia. And we were finally going to get to see what this very good team, who'd somehow done that, looked closer to full health if the injuries abated. And then the world change forever.
Well, again, if you care about such things, they're 1-2 against the Celtics so far this season, 0-2 against the Bucks. Although key players missed most of those games. At least one key player missed most of those games. The Raptors are really interesting to me in this sense. Against Milwaukee, obviously they don't have the best player on the floor. Against Boston, given Jason Tatum's rise, it's arguable. I would say Boston probably has the best player on the floor, but it's close. And against Philadelphia, they don't have the best player on the floor. Against Miami, they probably don't have the best player on the floor, although it's close. And yet, 1-7 is just as when you put Ibaka and Powell as guys 6 and 7, and Powell had a sensational year, a most improved player candidate. They are just absolutely rock solid. And that's before you get to like Terrence Davis, who's frankly earned my trust as a rotation player. And then when they just need to some shit up, in comes Chris Boucher, who has the wingspan of the entire width of the court and weighs about 110 pounds somehow. And Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, who is the captain of my up team, who just comes in. It's unclear what position he plays. It's unclear if he's playing basketball. He's just sort of moving around in there on diagonal angles and running into people, and like it works very well. But 1-7, there is just no weak spot on either end of the floor for any of those players. It's a rock solid group.
And I think you have to start with the defense and what you mentioned earlier. And my colleague at The Athletic in Toronto, Blake Murphy, wrote sort of a deep dive into the relaunch about where their offense and their defense stood. And their offense has some legitimate question marks, especially in the half court. But the defense, just by the array of stuff that Nick Nurse throws at you, just by like being able to run a zone that has the likes of Pascal Siakam, who I think took a step back in terms of individual defense, but is still one of the most important zone defenders in the league.
And when he dials it up, which I think we will see if we get to games that are meaningful, and again, everything about this is an if. When he dials it up, he can get back to the A defense level. He's shown that.
And you have Boucher, who's like the king of blocking 3-point attempts. And what's most interesting about their defensive profile is they allow a historic number of corner threes. Like it's like a huge outlier among teams from the last however many years.
All the years, Eric. Yeah. It's all the years. All of the years. 13.6% of Toronto opponent shots have been corner threes. Normally, if you're at 10%, it's a crisis. Yeah. And they're pushing 15.
Yeah, so, and yet, the second best defense in the league. So and 60, however many games, 66 games is not a small sample size. And there was some evidence that they were doing this last year. So you have to get in a debate with yourself or with somebody else. How lucky are they getting versus is there something that they do or many things that they do that are causing those missed shots? And, you know, I think we're both pragmatists and think it's probably a bit of both. But I think their utter predictability as well as length and activity probably unnerves a lot of guys who are getting those shots.
What's different about them, and this is, Pelton and I talked about this in relation to the Celtics, 3 of the best defenses in the entire NBA allow an absolute avalanche of three-pointers, which as recently as 3 seasons ago was considered just de facto a sign of bad defense. And in fact, it's been proven to some degree that the opposite can be true if you have the right personnel. What's interesting about Toronto is normally those teams that allow a lot of threes and still have good defenses are allowing a lot of above the break threes. And Toronto is allowing a lot of corner threes, which is why the tracking data that we have from Second Spectrum ranks them as the single luckiest defensive team in the NBA. And that takes into account, for those who are going to follow up, that takes into account the actual individual shooters who are taking those shots. It's not just like a generic expected field goal percentage based on average shooter X. It's the particular guys that are shooting. Now, even with that lucky defense, whatever, it's not like an enormous degree of luck that they're getting. And I do think those systems are not sophisticated enough to dial in on exactly what you just said. A, their schemes are wild and crazy and take some getting used to and unnerve people. And B, their defenders are long, fast, and ferocious. And I do think all of that stuff matters. And if they're getting a little bit lucky on defense, I would also posit to you, have they been a little bit unlucky on offense? Because very sneakily, one of the reasons that this team stayed really good this year is that their shot selection is now like Nick Nurse's wet dream. Like last year, it was like approaching that. This year, they're like very sneakily not quite Rockets, but like very, very close to like a reasonable version of the Rockets. Rim, threes, and like nothing else.
Yeah, and I think, Pascal Siakam's had a very good year in becoming the number one option, and that's another huge step for the guy to take after, just taking a monstrous step last year. But I think if you look at his percentages, he's been a bit unlucky in places he was scoring a ton from last year, and sort of the high paint area. His numbers are way down. He has shown an ability to get off different types of shots. Like, he looks way more comfortable in the mid-range, but those sort of little floaters and those little touch shots just aren't going down as much. And I think it's reasonable to say, that's the number one example of what you talked about to me, is like a guy who killed it from those areas last year just isn't getting the bounces. And then there's some 3-point shooters who aren't having as much success. I think their I'm not sure about this, but I think their corner 3 numbers aren't great themselves. But yeah, I do have some concerns about the half-court offense, because this is the best transition offense. I think when you mash together their efficiency and the number of time and the amount they get out on transition, they're really, really good at that. And starting from the first round last year against Orlando, you saw how much teams were trying to take that away from the Raptors. And smart teams are going to do that again. And if they have to punt offensive glass, they'll probably do that, because the Raptors kill you in transition. Norm Powell, I don't think, has missed in transition this year. And there's a bunch of other guys who are right there close with them. So if it does grind down into that, sort of cliche playoff pace, a lot of pressure is going to come down to how Siakam makes that growth. And then to counter my own counter, and we're getting deep now, they've been great in crunch time. So I don't know. Using Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet as screeners for Pascal Siakam really works.
They are maybe the best, by some measures the best, by other measures top whatever transition team in the league, and certainly the most beautiful to watch, and the one that I think hunts the outlet pass better. Even the second kick ahead pass, they're just bing, bing, bing. They're into their offense, and of course, when the game slows down, that was Kawhi Leonard's time last year, and that's what they don't have now. And one of the things that's interesting about that Milwaukee matchup is, I think to beat the Bucks, you have to make a certain number of pull-up jumpers in every game and a certain number of pull-up threes in every game, because that's the shot that the Bucks are going to give you. Long twos and pull-up threes, you're just going to get those. And yeah, you can work for better shots, and great offenses will get more of the better shots against even the Bucks defense than regular offenses, but you're still just going to have to hit a requisite number of those shots. And Toronto is not a great pull-up 3-point shooting team, a great pull-up jump shooting team. It's not quite in their wheelhouse as much as it was last year. I mean, you and I were both at Game 5 in Milwaukee, which they sealed, or kind of like the gut punches were a bunch of Kawhi Leonard pull-up threes over Brook Lopez on switches or drops or whatever. But on the flip side, they are one of the teams who can throw a lot of different looks at Giannis, and a lot of different guys who are, at least in theory, semi-physically capable of matching up with him. So I ask you this: when they play, and they've played twice this year, they're going to play once more, again, he'll see a lot of different looks, both man, zone. Everybody from Gasol to Lowry will probably get possessions guarding him, either on purpose or by accident. Who's the best matchup for him? Is it Anunoby now?
I still think it's OG Anunoby. I think he's the best, and this is a team with virtually no weak spots defensively. Norm Powell is probably the worst defender in their group, and I think he's basically league average. So you can't really make them too uncomfortable. But OG Anunoby has taken a huge leap this year defensively. He's a brick house, and he's just hard to move. That often doesn't matter for a guy like Giannis. So if you put Siakam onto him, Siakam spent a lot of the time on him in their first matchup way back in November, and it didn't go great, and probably hurt Siakam's game offensively too. So I don't think you want to go to that too often, given that Siakam's still getting used to the offensive load. So I think it's Anunoby. But then, like, you have Rondé Hollis-Jefferson. You have Serge Ibaka, who can credibly switch out on to him. You have Boucher, who can just at least give him length and hopefully, force him or force him to take a shot or a jumper over him. So they're not short on options, but I think as often as you can put OG Anunoby on him, especially since he profiles as sort of your fifth starter in terms of offensive load, I think that's the way to go.
Anunoby, to me, if I had to write a column, spoiler alert, I might, about like the 10 most important players or the 10 most interesting players in the restart, whatever, he would be on the list because he's the guy that Toronto, when the game slows down without Kawhi Leonard, they make hay on just really good passing in the half court. They're just a very clever passing team. Pick and roll, bing, Gasol swings it out, drive, kick, blah, blah, blah. They make, it's a whole motion 5-man game. And the guy that every team is going to try to direct the ball to when the Raptors get it moving is OG Anunoby, who shot, I think, 38% from three this year, which is the best mark of his career. A small but important uptick in assists, much more comfortable sort of pumpkin going off the dribble. But teams are going to force him to make those plays, and it's going to be it is going to, if they get to the second round and it's Boston, or they get to the conference finals and it's Milwaukee, one of the factors that's going to make or break their chances in those series is OG Anunoby ready for that on offense. On defense, he's ready. On defense, that dude is a stud, and he's going to be a stud for a long time.
I will say, and this was a very different iteration of the team, but last year was so weird for him for any number of reasons. In his rookie year, he was starting for the Raptors, and he was awesome in the playoffs. Like, he was, he wasn't asked to do as much, and, the DeMar Kyle Raptors were functionally different than the Kawhi-led Raptors, but he was great from three, and he made a little bit happen off the bounce. He's still, he's not as fluid as you like. You're always worried he's going to stumble when he puts it on the floor, but he does have some creativity around the rim with some pump fakes. He's even had some moments this year in the game against Denver, which was shortly before in Denver. That was their one loss during their 5-game road trip.
Maybe it wasn't that game. Again, this is all
he had a massive game that game.
Was it that? Yeah. But there are moments maybe in that game or in some other games where he had a little guy on him, and he went to the post and looked functional in the post, which is unfashionable as the post game is now. I keep saying this. In the playoffs, when the game slows down and you're facing the very best teams in the league who don't give you the easy stuff, you're going to need to get the hard stuff. And sometimes the hard stuff is they put their littlest guy on my weakest offensive guy who has a size advantage. Can he exploit it? And OG Anunoby has shown flashes of maybe sometimes.
And there's that, and then conversely, getting back to the Raptors' defense, and I know this is something you appreciate, that's part of what makes them so dangerous defensively, too, is try doing that to Kyle Lowry. It's a bit easier with Fred VanVleet, but not much easier to post him up and really make him pay. So that speaks to the Raptors' own defensive versatility and why, when Philadelphia made them go bigger, it was more of an offensive problem. It wasn't like they were getting pounded defensively. OG Anunoby, I think he was in John Hollinger's 10 players.
He stole that from me. I saw
he
that
stole
column.
the idea right out of your head.
No, I know he wrote the column, but I forgot that Anunoby was in it.
I won't tell anybody except for on this podcast if you don't. Yeah, he's going to be crucial to them, and I know there are some lineups that they didn't get too much this year, like the ultra-big lineup, which could be useful it doesn't seem likely now that they'll play the Sixers, but it's possible, where it's like Lowry or VanVleet at the point guard, and that it's Anunoby, Siakam, Ibaka, Gasol or something, if you want to go jump.
We'll see it. We'll see it. If the matchup dictates, we saw it against the Sixers without Anunoby, obviously, but we saw it against the Sixers last year. The one card that they just don't have the personnel to play it anymore is Siakam at center, which I thought would be a useful card for them to play in the playoffs last year. And it turns out Gasol and Ibaka were so good and have been so good, it's essentially not relevant to their team. But they do have some interesting lineup flexibility. Even Anunoby, Siakam, Hollis, Jefferson against random sort of bench hybrid lineups has been effective for them.
Yeah, like I wouldn't be surprised to see something like we saw it when they were injured. We saw Siakam and Anunoby starting up front, and then you could have Lowry, Van Vliet, Powell, or something like that. And there are lots of iterations that the Raptors can go with. The fact is, when Marc Gasol's on the floor, they've almost in all situations been a lot better. And Ibaka has just had a crazy good year individually and, serving as basically the de facto starter when Gasol's been out. His jumper's been really reliable. He's, become a bit more of a sound defensive presence beyond just the rim protection. Like, he's been great. So
Ibaka was sensational this year.
They have these options, but I think Nick Nurse probably has to check himself often and say, am I doing this just to do it, or is there a reason to do it? And that's the great luxury of this team, and basically the reason why you can say they're not going to have the best player in Series X or Series Y, but it's sort of hard to say the Raptors are going to lose necessarily because of that.
And a couple interesting wrinkles. Number one, the only Eastern Conference teams to rank in the top 10 in percentage of their shots that come from the corners. So the shots that you can get or have been able to get anyway against the Raptors, the juicy corner threes. Miami, who I don't think Toronto is scared of. Toronto, who is Toronto. Brooklyn, which is a team that essentially doesn't exist anymore, and that's it. Milwaukee's 14th, and so all those teams will get more corner threes against them, but it's not like there's a ton of Eastern Conference teams that are sitting there that are kind of built to exploit that weakness, if it is indeed a weakness. And the last thing to sort of watch for is, they're 3 games up on Boston. Boston has the tiebreak now. They play once in the restart.
Yeah.
I asked Kevin, and Toronto has a harder schedule than Boston.
Much harder. Yeah.
In the restart. I had Pelton, nerd-in-chief at ESPN, run the numbers, said, how many of your simulations have Boston passing Toronto to get into number 2? It's only 15%. And I don't think Boston is going to go gung-ho for number 2. I think their thinking is probably like Indiana without Oladipo is probably going to be 6th. So if we sit in 3rd, we are going to escape that Philly-Miami matchup, maybe, probably. But that number 2 seed is super, super valuable. It's essentially almost as good as, it's not as good as the number 1 seed because Orlando is going to be a decent number 7. Orlando was surging, at least on offense by the time the season stopped. But that number 2 seed is super valuable.
Yeah, and that's something that I was waiting for in the weeks between the announcement of the return to play and then the schedule being announced, which and I think it's in both teams' best interest that game comes as soon as possible. I think it's the 4th game on the Raptors schedule, and you'd probably want it even sooner if you were the Raptors, because if they win that game, they also, I think they would base it, not necessarily, but would essentially take over the tiebreaker, and it becomes almost mathematically impossible for Boston to catch them. You lose that game, you don't have the tiebreaker. Who knows? It could be tied by that point because the Raptors start against the Lakers and then the Heat, and before playing the Magic, I believe. It's a really tough schedule, and again, the point you brought up, Indiana's not as threatening as they once were, but weird things can happen in 8-game segments, and especially after they haven't played in 4.5 months. We have no idea what as much as we think things will pick up from where they left off, we don't know that, chemistry is that easy to rediscover, and, all that sort of intangible stuff that does matter. So I think, the second spot matters, and I don't think, like the Celtics, I don't think the Raptors will go all out for it, but better that than the alternative for sure.
Well, I know 2 things. Number 1, we deserve Toronto, Boston in the second round. We've been waiting for this series for a long time. We deserve it. It would be a fascinating series full of really interesting NBA characters, both young and old. And number 2, in a year that has been just abysmal on every potential level, in the NBA, the Raptors are maybe the best story in the league. To be this good and just good. I mean, they're not a cute, feel-good, overachieving story. They're demolishing teams this year. They have the scoring margin of a legitimate championship contender. Now, I don't know that they're that good, but they're really, really good. And for them to be this good and play this style after losing a player that many people, when they lost him, were characterizing as the best player in the NBA. I don't think Kawhi is quite that, although he's very, very close. It's one of the best stories in the whole league. And we've talked about it. We talked about it in December when I was there. I think Toronto fans have gotten something even better than a victory lap. This has got to be one of the most beloved teams in franchise history, and I'm excited to watch them play again. I love watching them play.
Yeah, that was my number one reaction to the league coming back, and like almost everybody else, I'm conflicted about it in any number of ways. But I'm glad for the fans and for the players and everybody involved with the organization that they get to put some kind of cap on this season, because, I wrote it back in November, December that this was the best story in the NBA, and it really hasn't changed. And it's a credit to everybody involved. And I have my doubts, I have my skepticism, but you're gonna have to play really well to beat this team 4 times in 7 games, and they're gonna make teams take that title away from them.
They're a real defending champion.
Yeah,
they're a real defending champion, and that's all you can ask for. I also am glad we got one organization in before this podcast ended, because it's very important to me whenever I have a Canadian on that we get an organization in, because I like the way you guys say that word. Okay, Eric Koreen of The Athletic. We have to get to Kevin Pelton now to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks. Thank you for your time. Stay safe up there, and I hope I see you. Boy, would I love to see you in Canada next Christmas. That would be great, if that's even possible.
Part of me says yes, and part of me says keep you guys all the way out of here. But hopefully the world is in a good enough shape that will be a sane thing to do.
Thank you, sir.
See ya.
All right, it's time to move on to team number 2 in this week's edition of So Where the Hell Were We? And that is the Milwaukee Bucks. And I want to welcome in ESPN insider, NBA analyst extraordinaire, Mr. Kevin Pelton. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's a great time. It's so much easier to do this now over this platform. I can see you, and you're not on a phone. This is so much more humane. The Milwaukee Bucks, I would argue, the team that has the most at stake as we enter the bubble, with Giannis's potential supermax waiting in the wings. 53-12, first in the entire NBA, an absolutely absurd, borderline pornographic, plus 11 points per game scoring differential. 5th in offense, 1st in defense by such a large margin that it's absolutely insane. They have answered. It seems hard to remember now, but when the season started, there was much fretting, including from yours truly, about what does the departure of Malcolm Brogdon mean for this Bucks team, because when we last saw the Bucks, Malcolm Brogdon was arguably the second best player on their team, as a couple of key members of their supporting cast suffered meltdowns to varying degrees against the Raptors in 4 straight losses. The Bucks have emphatically answered that question in 2 ways. Number one, everyone on the team individually, every holdover player on the team individually, including Giannis, got better. Most notably Dante DiVincenzo, but we'll talk about him in a second. And number 2, they haven't changed hardly anything about the way they play, which was, I think, the closest thing to a criticism of Mike Budenholzer, who may be the very best coach in the NBA, was they sort of stubbornly played this style, and they were unable to adjust when pushed, when faced with a team who could survive that style. They've just gotten even better at it. All the strengths that they had last year are even stronger this year. So on paper, they have answered the Brogdon question emphatically by saying it doesn't matter. So, Mr. Pelton, where are you on the Bucks? Have they answered that question? And what is most interesting to you as we ramp back up here?
I don't think that they can fully answer that question until the playoffs. I mean, as great as their regular season has been, and as you kind of went through that, the comparison that comes to mind is the 15-16 Warriors, where obviously that was a team that broke through and won the championship in their first year with a new head coach after making a similar transformation that the Bucks made. So that's a pretty key difference between them. But the same thing where, the talk from the Warriors that second season was, look, hey, we were still just figuring out Steve Kerr's system. We're going to be even better in year 2. And everyone's like, no, that's crazy. You won 67 games. You won the championship. How can you be better? And then, of course, they go out and win 73 games. So something kind of similar, I think, happened this year in Milwaukee without, again, of course, the championship. But I think if we're answering the question, where the hell were we with the Bucks? Like, nothing mattered all that much for the Bucks. The loss to the Lakers was probably the closest thing they had to a playoff game. So that was somewhat meaningful. That's a potential finals matchup. But the one question that I think really stands out about the Bucks since the All-Star break is how have they been integrating Marvin Williams?
I was wondering when Marvin Williams would come up. I didn't know if you were going to aggressively bring Marvin Williams up because he was their only he was their only acquisition. He's played about 200 minutes with them. Most of them, curiously, have come without Giannis. In sort of these, as the power forward in sort of these bench lineups. It's still unclear to me that he matters. Why it's interesting that he played so rarely with Giannis to me was that when they signed him, I thought, they're trying to load up on guys that sort of unlock more of these Lopez-less lineups, these Giannis at center lineups, and Marvin Williams could be one such guy as like a sort of more athletic Ilyasova, someone who can guard centers sometimes if Giannis doesn't want to, or Giannis can guard centers and Marvin Williams can guard forwards, but essentially unlocks those lineups that have been, A, not played very much, a little bit more than last year, but not very much still, and B, wildly successful and tailor-made for playoff basketball, and we just haven't seen him and Giannis together much. That was my thought when they signed him.
Yeah, same. And it'll be interesting to see how much we see the two of those guys together in the seeding games because, Milwaukee, they're locked into the 1 seed. They have a real opportunity to use this as an extended training camp, preseason, experiment with a bunch of different things. They also probably will be able to use the first round of the playoffs. Is that, if we're being honest at this point with what's happened with Brooklyn and Washington, the two potential they could still face Orlando, or there's still a better chance than you might think that they end up facing Orlando. But either way, they should walk through the first round. But going back to that Lakers game that they played, that was an adjustment that they made in the second half, is going to those Marvin Giannis lineups and taking advantage of them. And I think it does something crucial because if you look at Milwaukee's outside shooters, looking at catch and shoot unguarded 3-point opportunities or lightly guarded 3-point opportunities, it kind of, I think there are like 3 different groups that they have. You got 4 guys that are like plus shooters in that group: George Hill, Chris Middleton, Kyle Korver, of course, Ersan. You've got 4 guys who are about average: Dante DiVincenzo, Wesley Matthews has been probably better than that in his career, but about average this year. Giannis, on a very small sample size, has been about average. And then so has Marvin Williams. And then there's 4 guys that are below average: Pat Connaughton, a little bit of a disappointment for him, the Lopez brothers, and Eric Bledsoe. And to me, one of the big questions for Mike Budenholzer is, how do you minimize the number of times you have 2 of those guys in that bad group on the court together?
That's an interesting way to look at it. So, I mean, what we're talking around is like the Bucks. So what you just said goes to proving, like, you didn't even mention Sterling Brown, who I think still has a chance to be a good rotation player, a good 7th guy in the NBA. Doesn't even play hardly for the Bucks. They're insanely deep. Like, Pat Connaughton's a good player. Doesn't shoot it quite as well as you would hope he does, but a good player. DiVincenzo, again, doesn't shoot it as well as you hope he does, but is just a basketball player. George Hill, did he finish at 50% from 3 before the season was suspended? It was close. Just never missed the whole year. Korver, Bud is going to trust Korver with some playoff minutes. The love affair is too deep. And they're just really, really deep. But zooming out, when it's really time to play in the fourth quarter of playoff games against a great defense, and somewhere soon, whether it's Toronto or Philly or Boston, they're going to face a great defense. A great defense that can at least make Giannis work for it a little bit more than the mediocre defenses. Who was on the floor for them in the last 5 minutes of a game? And to me, it's Middleton, Giannis, blank, blank, blank. And they have a lot of options to fill in those blanks. That's not saying those players are bad. They have a lot of options to fill in those blanks. And that's good. That means you have a lot of stylistic flexibility. Lopez is going to be one of those blanks in a lot of lineups, and Lopez has been sensational for them. If Bledsoe has another shooting slump at the wrong time. You throw in George Hill, you have DiVincenzo, Matthews, blah, blah, blah. I find it fascinating how they're going to answer that question. And to me, I'm glad you brought up Marvin, because the Giannis at center lineups that I like the best are ones that don't have Ilyasova in them. I don't trust Ilyasova in the playoffs. And those lineups, even though they have Giannis, you're getting pretty small. You're playing Middleton at the 4, basically, with 3 guards. And Marvin Williams is a little too much of a traditional 4 for me to... he's just not as sort of quick and rangy as you would like. Like, they don't have another kind of like rangy 3 type to throw into those lineups that would really make me happy. But again, these are first world problems.
Well, what they don't have is the Harrison Barnes. Like, if you're looking at the death lineup equivalent, that was always Harrison Barnes, and then Kevin Durant, who is a better version of that. It's not surprising that the Bucks don't have a Kevin Durant, but Barnes is that guy that like comfortably slides down, and yeah, they haven't really had that. So I think Marvin is the closest thing to that. He was someone they were trusting to defend LeBron in that Lakers matchup. Because I don't think want to task Giannis necessarily with that assignment a whole lot, ideally.
Well, we saw that in the playoffs last year, where they didn't want to have him guard Kawhi, and they had great answers. They had like Brogdon and Middleton and did a decent job on Kawhi, but like Bud just didn't want to put him there. And like at some point, this isn't LeBron, who's 35 years old and really, really does need to be spared. Like at some point, Giannis is going to have to guard that guy. Whoever that guy is for the other team, Giannis is going to have to guard him. And by the way, he's going to win Defensive Player of the Year, and I think he deserves it. And so he should guard that guy when it matters.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it is, like, from a larger perspective, the simplest adjustment that the Bucks can make, and I don't know if they went to this as aggressively in that conference finals last year as I had hoped they would, is just play Giannis more. Just put more on Giannis's plate, because that's what you've been saving him for by playing him, 30 minutes a game the entire regular, like the fewest minutes of any MVP if he wins it ever, pretty much.
Well, and if you talk to people with the team, they will tell you that Giannis plays so hard every second that he gets winded a little bit faster. Or in the past has got like they play him in these short like 6 or 7 minute whatever it is stretches, and they take him out, because we were all screaming that last year, like, why is this dude playing 37 minutes when your season's on the line? Like, that should be 43, and they just wouldn't do it until the very, very end when it was really all on the line. So I agree with you. To the point about Giannis at center, this is from Ben Falk's site, Cleaning the Glass. 460 possessions Giannis at center this year. Plus 24 per 100 possessions, which is kind of like if the Globetrotters played the Washington Generals and they tried to rig it so the Generals lost by like 50, that's what it would be. No such lineup has played more than, I think, 21 possessions. So that tells you how evenly spread and sort of randomly constructed those lineups have been. They just haven't needed to and haven't found one that is the lineup. And maybe, by the way, maybe this entire discussion is just underrating Brook Lopez, who's been like, why do they have to not play Brook Lopez? Why do we focus so much on Brook Lopez's alleged limitations and not on how freaking good he's been for their team? Who is the team in the East that is playing Brook Lopez off the floor?
I don't think anyone's going to defensively. To me, the questions are more at the offensive end of the court, which is so funny. If you would have told us this about Brook Lopez 5 years ago, that we're going to talk about, sure, we grant that he's one of the 5 best defensive players in the league, but what about the other end of the floor?
Absolutely on the wild.
I mean, we have seen, it feels like they've taken more advantage this season of his ability to post up on switches and just still be Brook Lopez against smaller defenders. But his shooting this year has kind of picked up where it left off in last year's playoffs, and that was a bad place for it to pick up.
Well, but what the first thing you said is absolutely crucial for the Bucks, and I agree with you. It's a mini adjustment that Bud has really made well this year, which is that, like, I think in the Eastern Conference, the single best defensive answer for Giannis Antetokounmpo is Joel Embiid. And if Joel Embiid's on Giannis, that means someone smaller than Joel Embiid is on Brook Lopez. And maybe that's Al Horford, so the guy's not that much smaller. But the point is, in those situations, you have to remember what made Brook Lopez an all-star. And that was a really, really good post-up game. And Bud, this year, to his credit, has let him absolutely smash smaller guys in the post. And it's worked. Like, that can still work. It's not sexy, but it can still work. Yeah, the Bucks are sneakily, for a team that clearly makes its bones on shot selection, right? But on both ends of the floor, they have not been a great shooting team this year. I think they're like 17th in 3-point shooting, and as much as we focus on their ability or habit on defense of forcing bad shooters to take above the break threes, like that's how they win. That's been one of their big defensive philosophies. Protect everything else but that. Teams are going to do essentially the same thing to them, which is where are your worst shooters, to your point early on, we're going to let you guys shoot. And if the Bucks, who haven't been a great shooting team, they look like a great shooting team. When you watch them play and they're just rampaging, you're like, man, this team must be the best 3-point shoot. No, they're mediocre. If they have, this is the playoffs. If you have a bad 3-game slump against a great team, suddenly your season's in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, they're volume shooters in the sense that like a volume scorer is not necessarily doing it in a high efficiency. It's just you're getting up shots, and that's what they do from three is they get up threes because of the fact that, their shot selection is pretty optimized in terms of, focusing on attempts at the rim or from three, but, it's not necessarily extremely accurate shooting. And that, I think, so we focused so far primarily on the interior aspect of this question of who are the 5 guys out there at the end of games, but the perimeter aspect of it is really important too. Whether Bledsoe can at least shoot respectably enough to be part of that group, and then if not, is what we've seen from Dante DiVincenzo. His development is in year 2. Are you comfortable throwing him out there next to George Hill in the role that Malcolm Brogdon played last year at the end of the conference finals when that trust in Bledsoe had eroded and it was really Hill and Brogdon we were backcourt?
The one thing Brogdon, and again, I preface all this by saying they have dismissed the Brogdon question so far. But the one thing Brogdon could do, and he proved it against Toronto, is get you a bucket occasionally when there's nothing else in the system that is. He's not like it's not like he's Carmelo Anthony facing up on the wing and shooting a 19-footer, but you get him the ball at the top of the arc. He's an incredibly aggressive driver, and he doesn't really need a lot of space. He doesn't need to get inside you to get a decent layup. He's just so big and strong. He shoulders you and gets a layup up there. None of the guys you mentioned really have that gear other than Bledsoe in their game. But look, this is still the overwhelming favorite to get out of the East. I don't think there's any question about that. I think when you stack them up against the Lakers and the Clippers, it becomes a little bit of a coin flip. My favorite Bucks stat, by the way, regarding Lopez and Giannis and how good their rim protection is. So for the season, their opponents have shot 54.7% at the rim. That's number 1 in the league, stingiest figure by the following amount. Number 2 is Portland at 59.1%. So 54.7 to 59.1. That gap of 4.4 percentage points is the same as the gap between Portland and like number 16 or something. Like the Bucks defense has been so outrageously good. And if you have to boil down to why this team is so dominant, that's why. That plus Giannis, and Giannis is a big part of that. Like they are, the gap between their defense and everyone else is so big. Like they're really at their core an elite defensive team. They're not talked about in that sense as much, but that's what they are.
Yeah, people focus on the offense because of the fact that it's easier to pinpoint the way they're playing differently in terms of spacing the floor around Giannis and all that. But the improvement they made when Mike Budenholzer came, well, they improved a lot offensively. They improved a lot everywhere. It was more at the defensive end of the court. And, Lopez's arrival was a big factor in that. But again, 5 years ago, nobody would have said, hey, Brook Lopez, amazing defender. It's really in the context of this scheme and putting him in a position where he is almost exclusively around the basket, in position to play to his strengths and take away shots at the rim that has unlocked him and unlocked this defense. And I think to some extent, the last time I was on, we talked about the number of threes that they give up. To me, I think it's a little misleading because part of the reason that it happens is because if you take away all those shots at the rim, well, they have to go somewhere.
They have to go somewhere, right? And they take away the whole, and you don't, and they're not going at the foul line because they're number 1 in limiting free throw attempts, and they're not becoming putbacks because they're number 1 in defensive rebounding by I think 2 full percentage points. It's a joke how good they are in the defensive glass. This is what I mean by they took all the principles that were core to them last season and got better at all of them. I mean, they are And your point is fair. Like if they and that's why I was talking about this with Eric Koreen about the Raptors and thinking about the Bucks matchup. And I put this to you. To beat the Bucks, do you have to be a good pull-up jump shooting team, or do you have to be a good enough offensive team that you can, because the Bucks are going to give you pull-up jump shots. That's their whole thing, where you're going to be able to get a decent amount of pull-up jump shots. Now, they'll contest some of them because Bledsoe's arms are really long, and George Hill has been one of the best rear-view contesters in the NBA for years. Do you have to just have that skill in your wheelhouse, or do you have to be a good enough team that you don't need it? Or both, I guess.
It's probably a little of both, but I think the ratio of like how bad those shots are relative to everything else, that's the other thing that changes against the Bucks. If those good shots are off the table, then the okay shots become better. And I mean, that's what we saw from Kawhi in last year's playoffs, certainly, with his ability to make those shots. For some reason, the thought that popped into my head was going back to the Spurs were sort of the original team to do this defensively. It's unclear how much, with Bud on the coaching staff, by the way, it's unclear how much of that was specifically driven at that point by statistical analysis as opposed to just sort of their sense of these are the best shots for us to take away. And I remember in 2005 when they won the championship, the Sonics, for whom I was working and covering the team, actually gave them the toughest matchup in some ways because they had a bunch of guys who could make those shots. It wasn't plan A even for the Sonics. They shot a ton of threes relative to that era. But, Ray Allen, Rashard Lewis were able to make those difficult shots and make that a somewhat competitive series despite a pretty dramatic disparity in terms of overall talent.
It's interesting to think about it just because when you think of who are they going to have to beat to get out of the East? If you think that it's going to be a team that's really good at pull-up jumpers, that's going to be one of the core tenets of their team, Boston is the best answer to the Bucks. They're the best pull-up jump shooting team in the East by a lot. Philly, who I picked to make the finals before the season, and I just can't quit you, baby. I can't quit the Sixers. I'm all in. I'm all in till the end with the Sixers. I cannot quit the Sixers. I will be seduced. They are my siren song. They're the opposite, where they don't take any pull-up threes, and they've banked on defense and just beating the crap out of you inside, and Toronto is somewhere in the middle. So it's just an interesting question to think about. I want to wrap by saying this. We open by talking about what's at stake for the Bucks. And part of the reason why I think, and it's hard to know how any player, any organization who has a decision to make on their roster will look at this playoffs now, right? Is it just sort of, did you throw it out? It's just so weird. It's not normal. It's whatever. But you look at, like, the Bucks they feel new. This is like a brand, the second year of them being like a dominant team. Like, they just feel new. They're up and coming. They're actually lean old. And if I'm Giannis, I'm looking around. I'm like, well, Lopez is 30, whatever he is. Middleton's almost 29. Bledsoe's almost 31. Matthews is ancient. Korver is ancient. Connaughton and DiVincenzo are young. Sterling, but like, what are they really going to be? Are they going to be sixth men, fifth starters, eighth men? I don't know. Probably peak at fifth starter for DiVincenzo, who's a good basketball player. I gotta, like, this team's got to win now. It's not a team that has an enormous amount of time left in the primes. And Eric Bledsoe's had knee injuries, the whole thing. Like, it sneaks up on you how not young they are, if that makes any sense. And that's why that's the connected reason why the Brogdon decision, although there are questions about his long-term sort of sustainability too, health-wise, I think that's another reason less talked about why that was a big, big move for them not to make. Not that they made the wrong decision, but it was just putting a lot of eggs in the basket of this current group. And they got a pick for it too, I should say that.
Yeah, and it meant re-signing George Hill, who is older, and committing to him as part of your future. And yeah, I mean, I think this is somewhat inevitable for contending teams. Like, there are degrees to it. I think of your conversation that you had with Chris Bosh about the Heat and how, kind of they went towards older role players at the beginning. I guess that was more with Wendy. I'm conflating those two podcasts. They went with older role players at the start, and then that had eventual ramifications years down the road. The Bucks haven't been that aggressive. They haven't ignored young talent in any sense, but just kind of inevitably, if you're picking near the bottom of the round, if you're signing veterans to long-term contracts, these things add up. And that's part of, we probably don't talk about it enough is that's a logical reason why star players should be cycling through teams in a different way in the modern NBA than they did 20 and 25 years ago, because it was just much easier. It was more of a Wild West feel. If you were the Bulls, you could randomly trade for Dennis Rodman at the start of the second three-peat. And that's how you added, even though none of your young players had really panned out from that first year or something like that. It's difficult to sustain winning now. It's just it forces you to make these decisions that are inherently limiting how well you can win into the future. But the other wild card here is just Giannis's contract, the uncertainty about what the max is going to look like in the summer of 2021. Do I want to commit to a long-term deal now when the cap might be depressed for a few years because of the financial ramifications of, missing fans in stadiums? So that to me is a really big wild card from the Bucks standpoint.
We don't know what next season is going to look like on any basis at all. Period, full stop. It's the shrug emoji. But to your point about, what happens to championship teams, totally agree. And if you look at what LeBron has done since Miami, it's basically hunt young stars. It's basically find a young star that fits well with me, and it's Kyrie, and now it's Anthony Davis, and he's right to do it. If he's trying to win championships, that's the way to do it. You need to find something sustainable. All right, well, that's it for the Bucks. Kevin Pelton, I appreciate your time. And as I sign off with everybody, I will sign off with you. I hope I see you in person before 2022.
Hoping for it.
Time for the last of today's teams in So Where the Hell Were We? And let's get to the team that has maybe had the weirdest and most interesting season, in a long, long time. And that is the Utah Jazz, who rode the roller coaster all year and then became the first team to really get derailed by the coronavirus and derailed on multiple levels. And to help us talk about them, I'm thrilled to bring in Tim MacMahon, who just wrote a knockout story about the relationship between Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, which was, of course, spotlighted because of the coronavirus. So this is like the world we live in now. We just talk about the coronavirus all the freaking time. Tim MacMahon, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How about you?
Hanging in, my friend. Hanging in. Great story. So let's just get down to it. Like, Rudy Gobert is up for an extension after the season, a supermax extension. How worried should Jazz fans be about their two cornerstone players and whether they are going to be playing together 2 or 3 years from now?
So the Jazz folks I talk to feel very confident that this is a situation where it can be managed. It's not like the tension suddenly came with a positive test. This is something, there's been kind of steady tension between those guys, a typical NBA co-star tension, and then it just blew up because Donovan Mitchell got angry about getting coronavirus, blamed Gobert, despite the fact that can't be proven, for infecting him, and then did absolutely nothing to publicly indicate that he was willing to let it go until kind of a half-assed group Zoom session the other day. Having said that, the Jazz folks I talk to are very confident that these two guys can continue to be one of the most productive tandems in the league. Are they trying to convince themselves of that? I don't know. Maybe. I do think in terms of the immediate future, I think Gobert's contract negotiations are more complicated than perhaps even the relationship between those two, just because you mentioned he's Supermax eligible. I mean, you can just look at NBA economics, especially for a small market, and understand a Supermax offer's almost certainly not coming his way. So what middle ground can they maybe reach? But you can't, they don't have to be friends necessarily. But as Rudy said, there has to be respect. And I feel like Rudy has kind of bent over backwards, taking accountability, showing the respect to Donovan to try to kind of move forward. And I feel like Donovan really has done the bare minimum. And I'm quite certain that's been noticed by Rudy.
Well, it's the first thing you said, separate from all of this, Rudy Gobert's contract situation has been one of the sleeping giants in the NBA. I'm shocked at how little speculation there's been all year long, because I agree with you, he's not going to be offered the Supermax. That's just my educated guess. I'm not reporting that. It's just my educated guess. I think a Supermax for him would very likely be a bad to disastrous contract for the Jazz. as good as Gobert is.
Right.
And I Gobert is a very prideful player. He knows how good and valuable he is. The Jazz have been feeding him statistics that are maybe non-public for years, telling him how good and valuable he is. That just has the potential to get messy. And I don't know how it's going to happen or what. But the other thing the point you made in your story that I thought was really important was Gobert not making the All-Star team until this season. There was a reason that the Jazz were so upset about that, and it's because Gobert was upset about it. And beneath that, and this is the point you made, is you just wonder of like Gobert is intensely aware that he is not a traditional NBA star. He doesn't get the ball and like do fancy stuff and get buckets and get on highlights. That's just not what his game is. And he's so good at the stuff he's good at that I think he justifiably is like, well, I should get recognized as if I were a traditional NBA star because I'm that important to winning, and I'm not getting recognized that way. And so the way that he might react to that is well, look at my teammate who is, well, is that really fair? Or can I maybe get the ball more so I do get recognized that way? And well, okay, then Quinn Snyder has to navigate this tricky dance of like, that's not really your game. You're not really good. We're not going to feed you in the post. You're not Nikola Jokic. I just wonder if he had been 3-time All-Star Rudy Gobert by now, if a lot of this would be solved.
Right, and to be clear, the beef between him and Mitchell, kind of the 2 out of 10 on the NBA drama scale, has been Rudy bitching and moaning about not getting the ball. But he's not saying, I need to post up. I need to get jump shot. He understands what his game is now. He just is hyper aware of when he's open around the rim and he's not getting the ball. And by the way, he's right a lot, but that doesn't mean he's right to bitch and moan about it during a game. That doesn't mean the way he approaches it in film sessions the next day is right. That doesn't mean as he's running down the court, kind of angrily pointing up in the air saying lob, 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 that's the right way to approach it. And, Rudy, when I talked to him, he completely owned that. One of his quotes was, "I'm the a-hole," and he understands. And there's 2 things here. One, he does want to win, and he's he's leading. He led the NBA in field goal percentage last year, shooting 70% from the floor this year. Like lobs to Rudy Gobert are really high efficient plays. So he wants those as much as possible. When he's open for him, he doesn't get them. He gets really frustrated. So, yes, it's about wanting to win, and it's about being a part of building this program from a 25-win team his rookie year to a perennial playoff team that's trying to get to the next level. But it is also absolutely about caring so much about status that he starts to care about stats because he sees, a guy, just for an example, one of the guys who's gotten recognition over him has been Karl Anthony Towns.
I knew, before you even said the name, I knew what name you were going to say.
Right. And look, Karl Anthony Towns obviously is a ridiculously talented player who puts up big-time scoring numbers for a perennial losing team. And Rudy, he sees him, he's averaging 25-plus points per game, and he'll get recognition, where Rudy's, averaging 15 points per game for a team that's, top half of the West playoff picture on a consistent basis and isn't getting the same kind of recognition, although
he is a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year.
And 2-time All-NBA. And the sense I really got from Rudy, obviously there's been a ton of time for him to look in the mirror, to reflect, to kind of figure out, okay, what really matters? And I got a sense to him that and look, there's people with the Jazz, Alex Jensen's the one who really jumps to mind, the assistant coach who has helped guide him from being this skinny project to one of the best bigs in the NBA, who's very honest with him. And I think some of those messages have sunk in. The approach when he's complaining or lobbying for lobs, that matters. Are you prioritizing winning or status? You talk about winning all the time. Are your actions following up on that? And then, the other thing is I do think there have been times where Rudy has had a little envy because Donovan is so marketable. Because while Rudy's the most impactful player, Donovan is in a lot of ways the face of the franchise. He gets the endorsement deals. There's more number 45 jerseys by a long shot than there are number 27 jerseys in the stands, so on and so forth. And, Rudy, he denies that he ever cared about it. I don't necessarily believe that, but I do believe what he said basically came to the realization of he's more fun to watch. He's more charismatic. He's a more marketable player. And that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things.
And he's also the guy who came right after Hayward left. And in the same summer, and help the Jazz sort of weather what people at the time thought was a franchise crippling defeat in terms of they can't even keep this guy who's a homegrown product. They can't even keep him in Utah. The thing about the lob dunks, so it started earlier in the year. Gobert's dunks were way down.
Yeah.
And if you watch the games, you talk to people who were scouting the Jazz and coaching against the Jazz, teams, and I think the Jazz noticed this, teams were a lot better at disguising what they were doing against Gobert on the pick and roll. They would bring the help a little bit later, but they would bring it really, really hard. So Rudy would think, I'm open. But if you're Donovan Mitchell or Mike Conley and or Joe Ingles, and you've seen that defense 3 or 4 times, that hard help is coming, you have this moment of indecision of well, Rudy's open, but I know what's going to come if I throw the ball there. Does that mean the outside shooter on the weak side is going to be open? What do I do? And his dunks started to fall, and it's not necessarily because teams weren't looking for him. It's because I do think defenses got smarter about how they were defending him, and I think that's one of the reasons why Utah got off to a very strange 12-9. Their offense was just really jagged and disoriented and not producing the kind of shots that it didn't look like a Quinn Snyder offense. It wasn't producing the kind of shots that a Quinn Snyder offense is designed to produce. By the end of the season, it had started to get back on track toward that. But one of the reasons why is teams took away or made the Jazz maybe overthink those lobs to Gobert. It's not just sort of a black and white, are they looking for me or are they not kind of thing.
Right, and look, the fact that they changed point guards also had a pretty big impact. And you go from, Rubio was a guy who got to the point where he was a really effective lob thrower to Gobert. Who's Mike Conley ever thrown a lob to in his entire career? Marc Gasol's not catching lobs. So, you got Mike Conley. When you talk about a pick and roll partner, you can't get a whole lot different in terms of 7-foot pick and roll partners, Marc Gasol to Rudy Gobert. So there's that transitional period. I think Rudy in his mind, and look, I thought the same thing. Wow, they really improved the space, and they added Bogdanovich. That's going to open up the floor. Man, Gobert set an NBA record for dunks last year. Woo. Imagine now that the floor is wide open. So I think maybe his expectations got, really high in terms of, expecting his opportunities to increase his scoring to get bumped up, and it didn't happen. And there was certainly some frustration there. And then, the other thing, and I mentioned this in the story, is obviously Donovan's going to have the ball in his hands most often, as he should. He's their best creator. Donovan Mitchell is basically about 7 years into being a full-time basketball player. He was a baseball player growing up who also played basketball. It wasn't until he broke his wrist when he was 16 that basketball suddenly became his main sport. And as far as a primary playmaker, his freshman year at Louisville, he started only a handful of games. His sophomore year at Louisville, he was their best player, but he had a much higher usage rate as a rookie in the NBA for a playoff team than he did his last season in college. So you have to understand, as far as being your primary playmaker, Donovan Mitchell at 23 years old is very much learning on the job.
Yeah, it's I was talking to someone around the league the other day, and we were just sort of spitballing about players. And, there's a lot of people within the league who think Donovan Mitchell is still a little bit overrated, and this guy was one of them. We were talking about who would you rather have, Devin Booker or Donovan Mitchell, and I think the only skill in which Donovan Mitchell is ahead of Devin Booker is defense, and I don't think he's ahead by as much as you think he's ahead of Devin Booker. Passing,
if you want to say athleticism is a skill or whatever, but yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Passing wise, it's not close. Devin Booker is a way better passer than Donovan Mitchell, but as you said, it's going to take time, and there aren't many guys in the league. You wrote a great story about it last year. He's watching film with Quinn, with other coaches on the staff, looking at okay, freeze it here. What are my reads? What are my checkdowns? And like he's still learning all that stuff. So it's gonna take time for him to become just a that kind of creative player. But for what his experience level is, Donovan Mitchell is really good. And I've said it before on this podcast. He's got, you would call it the cojones factor. He's got it. He's got it. He's got something that you just can't teach and you can't learn and you can't develop really in your 30s or late 20s. He's got a certain level of guts and confidence in his core that is really hard to find. It makes me optimistic that whatever the best version of Donovan Mitchell is, maybe it's not as great as some of his backers think it is, but
maybe the Dwayne Wade comparisons need to simmer that.
Yeah, Dwayne Wade might be the third greatest shooting guard in the history of the NBA. Yeah. But whatever the best version of that is, he's going to hit it.
Right. And look, with Donovan, he got placed into a situation where, despite it being a kind of a small market and Utah being an under the radar team, he got thrown into a situation where a month into his career, he is the go-to guy on a team with, legitimate playoff aspirations, and there's a ton of pressure that comes along with that. He also got thrown into a situation where, as a rookie who was a late lottery pick, he could thrive in that, and that's a lot because of the system. That's a lot because of the, surrounding parts, and it's a lot because he's playing with Rudy Gobert, who is the best screen setter in the NBA, who is, an elite roll man and finisher, and who is going to clean up a ton of your defensive mistakes on the other end. And Rudy, as he said, he can be annoying, very annoying, a-hole, whatever you want to call it. Somebody I really respect with the Jazz earlier this year, before all this stuff blew up, before the season was suspended, I was talking to him, and he said, Rudy isn't the easiest guy to play with, but he's one of the best guys to play with. In other words, Rudy can be a pain in the butt, but boy, does his game make you better.
Well, he's one of those
experience.
He's one of those guys who, when he's not on your team anymore, you probably think, boy, I didn't really value the security of, like, that guy's behind me on every single defensive possession. Like, that dude, if I make a mistake, that dude's the one waiting for me. Like, that's a huge, huge deal. The other quote from your story that I think resonated with me, something that is applicable not just in the NBA, but I think it was an anonymous source said something along the lines of, it's not about being right all the time. And I'm assuming that was about Gobert because, saying I'm open. I'm like, look, the film will show that I'm open. And the first NBA player I thought of other than Gobert was Chris Paul. And that's something you heard about Chris Paul at almost every stop is like, dude, we know, like, you're right. You see the game better than all of us. It's like, you just got to modulate how often you're telling me that you're right. Because even if you're right every time, and Chris Paul's a freaking genius, he's going to be right every time, there comes a point where people just don't want to hear your voice for a little while. And I think that's across every industry. I thought that quote was very, very telling.
You're married. You can relate to that, I'm sure. And, it is. It's something.
Just going to move right along in the conversation.
I'm divorced. I can relate to it. It is something that it's very applicable in NBA partnerships. And really in relationships, whether they're personal or business relationships across the board. But, it's that thing where, okay, Rudy, you're right. But, man, if you're just bitching and moaning every time somebody misses you when there's a crack of daylight, the comparison I made in the stories, it's like the wide receiver who runs back to the huddle telling, I was open. And the quarterback's thinking, dude, I got a 320-pound guy coming up the middle. I got a 275-pound guy screaming around the edge trying to rip my head off. Like, I ain't going to see you every time. Now, Donovan Mitchell's not getting blindside hit or anything, but he's the focal point of a defense where a lot of things happening real fast. He's and learning on the job. He's not going to see it every time. Rudy understands that, but has to practice, has to understand that in the heat of the moment.
I think it's interesting we've gone 17 minutes and we haven't talking about their playoff chances, and which is interesting because the Jazz are 41-23, fifth in the West, eighth on offense, 11th on defense, which is lower than you would expect given they have maybe the best defensive player in the NBA, backlining their defense. And I think a lot of the reason that we haven't talked much about them is that, A, the West is absolutely loaded and the top two teams are just are just better than everyone else. And B, I am very curious about the degree to which the Bogdanovic injury is catastrophic for them, because on paper it's catastrophic. They just don't have anybody like him on their team in terms of high volume 3-point floor spacer, legitimate small ball power forward size, all in one package. Doesn't need the ball. They have a lot of guys who need the ball. For the season, they're plus 5.5 with Bogdanovic on the floor, and -2 or -3 when he's off the floor. And you can finagle the numbers anywhere you want. You can say, well, what were they like when he was off the floor, but all their other best players were on the floor? Still negative. I do think once they settle in and they figure out how to play, whether that's starting Royce O'Neal and Ingles together and making O'Neal kind of your small ball four, I do think they'll find ways to compensate where it's not that stark and he's not as irreplaceable as the numbers would suggest he is. But I do think his absence creates a void on their team that no one is really equipped to fill, and leaves them kind of short a certain type of player that is critical to how their team is built.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason they paid him 70 some odd million in the summer, and he's lived up to that. Been not just a 20-point per game scorer, but a very efficient 20-point per game scorer who does open the floor for everybody. I'm curious to see how Quinn Snyder adjusts. Does he start George Niang, who, this is a guy who he's a great developmental success story for him. 2 years ago, he's playing for the Salt Lake City Stars, their G League team, almost the whole year. He's gotten to the point. Their bench got a lot better, obviously, when they got Clarkson, but also when Niang replaced Jeff Green.
George Niang, Tony Bradley, 4 or 5 backup duo was killing it.
Yeah, and Niang he's only averaged 13 minutes a game. So it's been a small role, but he's shooting, like almost 42% from three in, for those minutes, pretty high volume. So he is, in a small role, has been an effective, volume shootings, floor spacing four. Boy, but 13 minutes to 30 minutes,
and who you're guarding as in terms of opposing starters versus opposing backups.
Right,
it's a
not
big
for the guy in the world.
Big difference.
Yeah,
I think the safest thing to do is start O'Neal, which is Conley, Mitchell, O'Neal, Ingles. Gobert's only played 14 minutes the whole season, that lineup, which is shockingly low, although there's been injuries up and down. And on paper, I do think that lineup has a chance to be effective because Royce O'Neal's a good player. He's a decent shooter, although he needs some space. He's a really rugged defender. Ideally, you'd like to have him guard the best wing on the other team. That may not be possible anymore. But it's one of the reasons I'm a little optimistic that the loss of Bogdanovic won't quite be as catastrophic as the numbers say, but I do think it's just sort of, to me, for the Jazz, I think the season is a wash a little bit. If they win a round, that's great. It'll be somewhat matchup dependent. But to me, his injury just sort of like the Jazz are kind of to be continued next season.
Yeah, and really, what team do you take a 20-point per game guy out of the lineup and say, you know what, their chances are as good as they were before? I mean, it's just a huge loss. And so they're dealing with that loss while dealing, as much as everybody says, yeah, we're ready to move forward. And Donovan, right now we're good, which, boy, that right now is, wow, that's two pretty heavy words. But you're dealing with the awkwardness of your franchise cornerstones, publicly trying to mend fences and move forward, and the loss of a 20-point per game guy. I've got a hard time seeing him get out of the first round.
Well, again, it'll depend on the matchup. There's like a huge amount of variability in where they can go. One of the things to watch is their tiebreaker with Oklahoma City will be decided in the bubble, again, if these games actually happen and we go forward with the season. But yeah, I mean, look, and the other thing is maybe even if they don't win a round, as you said, maybe you get a little more trial and error with Mike Conley and Donovan Mitchell. And Mike Conley's been one of the more up and down players all season and had finally kind of settled into a groove when the season stopped. The Jazz had won, I think, 5 of 6, mostly against bad teams, but still had a nice win in Boston. And so maybe you just say, again, to be continued. At least we get to see more of this. We haven't seen a lot of it. Let's see more of it.
Well, and Conley's going to have to score more. I mean, those 20 points per game aren't going to get replaced by Royce O'Neal, George Niang. Conley, who's, as recently as last season in Memphis was a 20-plus point per game scorer, is going to have to be significantly more productive than he has been on a whole this season.
We will see what happens, but again, the Jazz remain really interesting, and it's been a tough year and an interesting year for them. And you've chronicled it really well, and that story, if people haven't read it, it's still on ESPN.com now. It's a fantastic story. Tim MacMahon, I always love getting a beer or multiple beers, several beers plural.
You stereotype me here.
With you at our annual preseason camp, usually in Los Angeles.
If I have just one, it's at the Yard House, and it is a yard.
Yeah, but who knows when the next time we'll be able to do that is. But I look forward to doing it again, and the best to your family, and stay safe.
Same to you, man. Appreciate you having me.